On the afternoon of September 9, 1943, a column of fire rose 1,000 meters into the Mediterranean sky. A 1,500-ton gun turret, complete with 3 massive naval rifles, was hurled into the air like a child's toy. In that moment, nearly 1,400 Italian sailors perished. And in that same terrible instant, the nature of naval warfare changed forever. This is the story of the Italian battleship Roma, one of the most powerful warships ever built, and the revolutionary weapon that destroyed her in minutes. It is a story of political chaos, of men caught between loyalty and duty, of a fleet fleeing its former allies, and it is the story of the birth of precision-guided warfare, a technology that would eventually render the great battleships obsolete. But before the fire, before the explosion that tore Roma apart, there was a ship. There were 2,000 men, and there was an admiral who would face an impossible choice. The Roma was a marvel of Italian engineering. Laid down at the Cantieri Riuniti dell'Adriatico shipyard in Trieste on September 18, 1938, she represented the pinnacle of Italian naval ambition. At nearly 241 meters long, the length of 2.5 football fields, she displaced over 45,000 tons at full combat load. Her main armament was terrifying: 9 381mm guns arranged in 3 triple turrets, capable of hurling 885-kilogram armor-piercing shells over 42 kilometers. Her belt armor reached 280 millimeters thick, backed by an innovative decapping plate designed to strip the caps from enemy shells before they could penetrate. Her 4 steam turbines generated 128,000 horsepower, pushing her through the water at 30 knots. Roma was the third and finest of Italy's Littorio-class battleships, incorporating lessons learned from her sisters Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. She was slightly longer, carried additional anti-aircraft guns, and featured a redesigned bow for better seakeeping. When she was commissioned on June 14, 1942, she became the flagship of the entire Italian fleet. But Roma would never fire her guns in anger. The Italian fleet was crippled not by enemy action, but by something far more mundane: oil. Italy had no petroleum of its own and depended entirely on Germany for fuel. By late 1942, supplies had dwindled so severely that the mighty Roma could barely leave port. In her 15 months of service, she would sail just 2,492 miles in only 133 hours of operation, roughly 20 sorties, none of them combat operations. She and her crew waited. They drilled. They watched Allied bombers rain destruction on Italian ports. In June 1943, American B-17s struck Roma herself, punching 2 bombs through her hull and flooding her with 2,350 tons of seawater. Repairs took weeks, and all the while, the war turned inexorably against Italy. Aboard Roma were nearly 2,000 souls, 92 officers, over 1,500 sailors, plus the staff of Admiral Carlo Bergamini, who commanded the entire Italian battle fleet from her bridge. These men were about to become unwitting participants in one of history's pivotal moments. But to understand what happened to them, we must first understand the weapon that killed them, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. In 1938, as Roma's keel was being laid in Trieste, a German engineer named Dr. Max Kramer began conducting experiments that would revolutionize warfare. At the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt in Berlin-Adlershof, Kramer was attempting to solve an ancient problem of aerial bombardment, hitting a moving target. The Luftwaffe had learned hard lessons during the Spanish Civil War. Ships maneuvered, winds shifted. Even the best bombardiers rarely hit their targets. Hundreds of bombs might be expended to achieve a single strike. Kramer believed there was a better way. His solution was the Fritz X, officially designated the Ruhrstahl SD-1400X. It was, in essence, an armor-piercing bomb with a brain. The Fritz X weighed 1,570 kilograms, nearly 3/4 of a ton of steel and explosives. Its body was forged from thick-walled steel, and its nose cap was made of hardened chromium-vanadium alloy designed to punch through battleship armor. The warhead contained 320 kilograms of amytal, fitted with a delay fuse that allowed the bomb to penetrate deep inside a target before detonating. But what made the Fritz X revolutionary was its guidance system. The weapon featured 4 small wings and a distinctive box-shaped tail housing the Kehl-Strasbourg radio control system. Inside the tail were 2 gyroscopes for stabilization and a radio receiver connected to movable spoilers, small control surfaces that could alter the bomb's trajectory in flight. A flare candle in the tail ignited upon release, allowing the bombardier to track the weapon visually as it fell. Using a joystick in the aircraft, he would align the glowing flare with his target, sending radio commands that adjusted the bomb's flight path in real time. It was, in effect, the first precision-guided munition, an ancestor of the smart bombs that would dominate 21st-century warfare. The system required the bomber to fly straight and level at high altitude for 25 to 30 seconds after release, a dangerous vulnerability, but the results justified the risk. In testing at Peenemünde, 50% of Fritz X bombs landed within 14 meters of their aim point. Compared to conventional bombs, which scattered across hundreds of meters, this was extraordinary accuracy. When the Fritz X struck water, it reached velocities approaching the speed of sound. It could penetrate 130 to 200 millimeters of armor, enough to punch through the deck of any battleship afloat. And because it was released from 5,500 meters or higher, the launching aircraft remained beyond the effective range of most naval anti-aircraft guns. By the summer of 1943, the Fritz X was ready for combat. Kampfgeschwader 100, a specialized Luftwaffe bombing unit based in southern France, had trained extensively with the new weapon. Their Dornier Du 217 K2 bombers, modified with extended chings for high-altitude operations, each carried a single Fritz X beneath their starboard wings. They needed only a suitable target. While Kramer perfected his weapon, Italy was collapsing. The Allied invasion of Sicily on July 9, 1943, was the largest amphibious assault in history to that point. Over 150,000 troops landed on the island's southern shores, supported by more than 3,000 ships and 4,000 aircraft. Within weeks, the campaign exposed the hollowness of Italian military power. German commanders privately acknowledged they were fighting alone. Italian forces melted away. By August 17th, when Allied troops entered Messina, Italian popular support for the war had evaporated entirely. On the night of July 24 to 25, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism met in Rome for the first time since 1939. In a scene of Shakespearean betrayal, 19 members voted to strip Benito Mussolini of power. Even his own son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano, voted against him. The following afternoon, King Victor Emmanuel III dismissed the dictator who had ruled Italy for 21 years. "My dear Deuce," the king told him, "it cannot go on any longer. Italy is in pieces. You are the most hated man in Italy." Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned at Campo Imperatore, a ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains. Marshal Pietro Badoglio became prime minister, and secret negotiations with the Allies began almost immediately. But Badoglio faced an impossible situation. He had to negotiate surrender while 100,000 German troops occupied Italian soil. One false move would trigger catastrophe. Germany was not fooled. Even before Mussolini's fall, Hitler had ordered contingency plans for Italian betrayal. Operation Axis, detailed how German forces would disarm their former allies and seize control of Italy. For 45 days, Italy existed in a twilight state, officially still at war alongside Germany, secretly negotiating with the Allies, its population exhausted and starving, on daily rations of barely 1,000 calories. And through it all, Admiral Carlo Bergamini and the Italian fleet waited at La Spezia, uncertain of their fate. On September 3, 1943, in an olive grove near Cassibile in Sicily, Brigadier General Giuseppe Castellano signed the armistice of Cassibile on behalf of Italy. The surrender was unconditional, but it was also secret, so secret that even Admiral Bergamini was not informed. 5 days later, on the evening of September 8th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower broadcast the news from Radio Algiers at 6:00 p.m. Italy had surrendered. The announcement caught the Italian armed forces completely by surprise. At 7:42 p.m., Marshal Badoglio addressed the Italian nation. His message was fatally ambiguous, Italian forces should cease fighting the Allies, he said, but react against every kind of attacks having other origin. What did that mean? Fight the Germans? Surrender to them? No one knew. Within 8 minutes of Badoglio's announcement, the German High Command broadcast the code word Achse to all units. The betrayal Hitler had anticipated was confirmed. Italy was now an occupied country. Across the Italian peninsula and beyond, chaos erupted. German forces attacked their former allies. 9 Italian divisions were rapidly disarmed. In the Balkans, over 500,000 Italian soldiers would be captured, and on the Greek island of Cephalonia, more than 5,000 surrendering Italians would be executed. The Italian fleet was suddenly the most valuable prize in the Mediterranean. Under the armistice terms, all Italian warships were to be transferred immediately to Allied ports. For the Allies, securing the fleet meant gaining 3 modern battleships, 6 cruisers, and dozens of smaller vessels. For the Germans, allowing that transfer was unthinkable. At La Spezia, Admiral Bergamini received orders to sail. His destination, La Maddalena, a naval base in northern Sardinia, where he would receive further instructions. From there, the fleet would proceed to Malta in Allied control. But Bergamini was troubled. He had not been consulted about the armistice. He did not know its full terms. He feared his ships might be seized, his sailors interned, his nation's honor forfeit. As tensions aboard his ships reached dangerous levels, he summoned his officers and reminded them of their duty. "No one should ask for directives," he announced. "They will come when needed." In the early hours of September 9th, the Italian battle fleet put to sea. Roma led the way, followed by Vittorio Veneto and Italia, accompanied by 6 cruisers and 8 destroyers, 17 warships carrying thousands of men into an uncertain future. Significantly, the fleet did not display the black surrender panels required by the armistice agreement. At 3:00 a.m. on September 9, 1943, the Italian fleet slipped out of La Spezia harbor under cover of darkness. Admiral Bergamini stood on Roma's bridge as his ships formed a line and headed south along the Italian coast, then west toward Corsica. The fleet made 22 knots, a respectable speed, though not their maximum. The weather was clear. The Mediterranean sparkled under late summer sun as the morning progressed, but the Germans were already tracking them. At 8:00 a.m., Admiral Mienzen-Bolken, commander of German naval forces at La Spezia, sent an urgent message to Berlin. The Italian fleet has departed during the night to surrender itself to the enemy. At Istres airfield near Marseille, the crews of 3 KG-100 were already preparing their Dornier Du 217s. Each aircraft was loaded with a single Fritz X bomb. Major Bernhard Jope would lead the attack. Aboard Roma, the morning passed without incident. By noon, the fleet was approaching the Strait of Bonifacio, the narrow passage between Corsica and Sardinia. Bergamini ordered a 90-degree turn toward La Maddalena, where he expected to receive further orders. Then, at 1:40 p.m., everything changed. A telegram arrived from Supermarina, the Italian naval command in Rome. La Maddalena had been occupied by German forces. The safe harbor Bergamini sought no longer existed. The admiral immediately ordered a course reversal. The fleet would bypass Sardinia entirely and head for Beaune, Algeria, Allied territory. The ship swung around, passing the rocky island of Asinara off Sardinia's northwestern tip. It was at this moment that lookouts spotted aircraft at high altitude. The planes were too distant to identify. Were they Allied escorts, as promised in the armistice, or something else? Bergamini's orders were to fight only if attacked. The fleet held its fire. By 3:10 p.m., 15 Dornier 217 bombers were visible, approaching in formation. Still, the Italians hesitated. The aircraft flew at unusual angles, releasing bombs in ways the Italian officers had never seen. At a 60-degree trajectory, rather than the conventional 80 degrees, only when bombs began falling did the truth become clear. At 3:30 p.m., Major Jope's aircraft made the first attack run. His observer, Unteroffizier Laurie Klaproth, released a Fritz X aimed at the battleship Italia. The bomb fell wide, but not by much. It struck the water just off Italia's stern, sending a massive wall of spray crashing over the ship. The force of the explosion temporarily jammed Italia's rudder, though she was able to continue using auxiliary steering. Now the Italian gunners opened fire. Every anti-aircraft weapon in the fleet erupted, filling the sky with flak. But the German bombers were at 5,500 meters, beyond the effective range of the Italian guns. The shells burst harmlessly below their targets. Aboard Roma, Admiral Bergamini watched the attack unfold. His flagship was now steaming at reduced speed, her crew racing to battle stations. The great ship's anti-aircraft batteries thundered, but they could not touch the aircraft above. At approximately 3:45 p.m., the first Fritz X struck Roma. The bomb hit the starboard side aft of amidships. Unlike a conventional bomb, it did not explode on impact. Instead, it punched through 7 decks of the ship, exiting through the hull below the waterline. Only then did the delay fuse trigger detonation. The explosion occurred beneath Roma's keel. The effect was catastrophic. The blast ruptured 2 boiler rooms and flooded the aft engine room. Roma's 2 inboard propellers went dead. Her speed dropped from 22 knots to just 10. Throughout the after portion of the ship, electrical arcing ignited countless fires. Damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding, but the great battleship was already crippled. Roma began falling behind the rest of the fleet. For the next 15 minutes, the crew fought desperately to save their ship. Firefighters battled blazes. Engineers worked to restore power. Bergamini remained on the Admiral's bridge, directing damage control efforts and communicating with Supermarina. Then came the second wave. 7 more Dornier 217s approached. Among them was Lieutenant Klaus Daumling of 7 KG 100, with observer Unteroffizier Heinrich Penz, a young man on his very first combat mission. At approximately 4 o'clock p.m., Penz released his Fritz X. This bomb struck Roma's starboard side between the bridge and the No. 2 main turret. It penetrated the deck armor and detonated in the forward engine room. The explosion ignited the forward magazines, the ammunition storage compartments for the No. 2 turret. What happened next defied comprehension. The magazine explosion was instantaneous and total. A column of fire and smoke rose 1,000 meters into the Mediterranean sky. The No. 2 turret, 381mm guns, weighing 1,500 tons complete with their armored housing, was blown completely off the ship and hurled into the sea. Admiral Carlo Bergamini, Captain Adone del Cima, Rear Admiral Stanislao Caraccioti, and every man on the bridge and in the forward superstructure were killed instantly. Below decks, the majority of the crew burned alive. Roma's hull, stressed beyond any design limit, began to fail. The bow, catastrophically flooded, plunged beneath the waves. The ship listed heavily to starboard, rolling until her deck was nearly vertical. Then, at approximately 4:12 p.m., she capsized. As she turned over, her hull broke in 2. The forward and aft sections separated, each section sinking independently into water over 1,000 meters deep. By 4:15 p.m., barely 23 minutes after the first hit and perhaps 10 minutes after the fatal second strike, the battleship Roma was gone. Of the approximately 2,021 men aboard, only 596 survived. The remaining 193 sailors died, the greatest loss of life on any Italian warship during the Second World War. Among the dead were 2 admirals, 86 officers, and more than 1,200 sailors. They had sailed that morning as members of the Italian fleet. They died as victims of a weapon no one aboard had ever imagined. The destroyer Mitragliere and the cruiser Attilio Regolo, along with several other vessels, broke from the fleeing fleet to rescue survivors. Men bobbed in the oil-slicked water, many suffering terrible burns. They were pulled from the sea and taken not to Italy, now a battlefield, but to Port Mahon in Minorca, part of neutral Spain. There, in a hospital on the Isla del Rey, Spanish nuns and doctors treated the wounded. 26 Italian sailors died of their injuries and were buried in Spanish soil, where they remain to this day. The survivors were interned in Spain for the duration of the war. The remaining Italian fleet, now under the command of Admiral Romeo Oliva, continued to Malta. The next morning, September 10th, they dropped anchor. beneath the guns of Valletta's ancient fortifications. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, sent a famous message to the Admiralty in London. Pleased to inform your lordships that the Italian battle fleet now leats at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta. It was the end of the Regia Marina as an independent fighting force. Vittorio Veneto and Italia, the latter bearing the scars of a Fritz X that had punched completely through her hull, were interned and would never fight again. But for Germany, the sinking of Roma was more than a tactical success. It was a demonstration of a new kind of warfare. The destruction of Roma marked a turning point in military history that was not fully understood at the time. Before September 9, 1943, no ship had ever been sunk by a precision-guided weapon. Battleships, armored behemoths that had dominated naval warfare for half a century, were considered vulnerable primarily to other battleships, torpedoes, or massed air attacks. A single bomb, no matter how large, was unlikely to sink a modern capital ship unless it struck precisely the right spot. The Fritz X changed that calculation forever. In the weeks following Roma's destruction, Fritz X bombs would strike the American cruiser USS Savannah off Salerno, penetrating her sea turret and killing 197 sailors. The British cruiser HMS Uganda was hit through 7 decks. Most dramatically, the venerable battleship HMS Warspite was struck by 3 Fritz X bombs, one of which passed through 6 decks before exploding. She survived, but required 9 months of repairs. The Allies scrambled to develop countermeasures. American scientists analyzed captured equipment and developed radio jammers, though early versions targeted the wrong frequencies. The British Type 650 transmitter proved more successful, jamming the 3 MHz intermediate frequency that the Kehl-Strasbourg system used. By late 1943, Fritz X attacks were becoming increasingly ineffective. But the genie was out of the bottle. The principles demonstrated by the Fritz X, standoff delivery, radio command guidance, precision strike capability, would echo through the following decades of military technology. The wire-guided TOW missile, the laser-guided bomb, the GPS-directed JDAM, all trace their conceptual ancestry to Max Kramer's creation. More fundamentally, Roma's destruction signaled the beginning of the end for the battleship. If a single bomb could destroy the world's newest dreadnought in minutes, what future did such vessels have? The aircraft carrier, already ascendant after Pearl Harbor and Midway, would completely supplant the battleship within a decade. Roma was not merely a casualty of war. She was a herald of warfare's future. The wreck of Roma lay undiscovered for nearly 70 years. In June 2012, an underwater robot called Pluto Palla, designed by Italian engineer Guido Gay, located the remains approximately 30 kilometers off Sardinia's northern coast at a depth of 1,000 meters. The ship lies in 2 sections, her hull torn apart by the magazine explosion that killed her. Surveys by the Italian Navy have revealed haunting details. The stern section remains well preserved, with anti-aircraft guns still pointed at the sky. Amidships, the superstructure is visible: the dashboard, the wheelhouse, the signal station. The Admiral's Bridge, where Carlo Bergamini gave his final orders, has been identified. Within the broken hull, the remains of 1,393 sailors lie entombed. The wreck has been designated a military shrine, protected by Italian law. Every September 9th, Italy commemorates the Day of Memory of sailors disappeared at sea. Ceremonies are held at Porto Torres in Sardinia, overlooking the waters where Roma sank, and at the monument to the sailor in Brindisi. The Italian Navy reads the sailor's prayer and lays wreaths upon the waves. In 2023, President Sergio Mattarella attended the 80th anniversary commemoration. Many Italians died so that the homeland could resume its authentic and free path in history, he said. From that 9 September 1943, the national redemption, the liberation struggle, began. In Menorca, the hospital where survivors were treated has been restored. A small museum commemorates the Roma and her crew. The Spanish town of Mahon has entered a pact of friendship with Italian communities touched by the tragedy. The last known survivor of the Roma, Gustavo Bellazzini, died in May 2025 at the age of 103. In his final years, he offered a simple testimony: "I have a very good memory. I may forget what I had for breakfast, but I will never forget my ship. The story of Roma is, in many ways, a story of transitions. It is the story of Italy's transition from Axis partner to co-belligerent, a wrenching shift that cost thousands of lives and divided the nation for generations. It is the story of Carlo Bergamini, a man of duty who followed orders even when he did not fully understand or agree with them, and who paid for that loyalty with his life. It is the story of naval warfare's transition from the age of the battleship to the age of precision strike, a change that the sailors aboard Roma could not have imagined as they steamed out of La Spezia that September morning. And it is the story of technology's remorseless advance. Max Kramer and his colleagues sought only to solve a military problem: how to hit a moving target from high altitude. In doing so, they created a weapon that would reshape warfare for the century to come. Today, precision-guided munitions are ubiquitous. Bombs guided by lasers, by GPS satellites, by infrared seekers can strike within centimeters of their aim points. The principle is the same one Kramer demonstrated in 1943. A weapon that can be directed after launch, that can adjust its flight path, that can strike exactly where it is aimed. The sailors of Roma did not know they were dying at the dawn of a new age. They knew only fire and water, chaos and terror, and the desperate struggle for survival as their ship broke apart beneath them. They deserve to be remembered not merely as victims of a terrible weapon, but as men who served their country in its darkest hour, who followed orders into uncertainty, and who met their fate with the courage that sailors have shown throughout history. The guns of Roma are silent now, rusting in the deep Mediterranean darkness, but her story endures, a testament to human courage, to technological change, and to the terrible price of war.